Okay, this video is probably, I'm going to try to make it as short and simple as possible, but I wanted to say that a lot of times America is very giving, and a lot of times they can be giving to the wrong people, sometimes to the wrong ones. And I'm going to start it off by examining this article that was put out in 2015. And I don't know if people have forgotten about this, but some may not even know. This is out of the San Diego Union Tribune. And so this was back in 2015, January 25th, by a Christina Davis. She was a contact reporter that you would. Okay, so this guy in this picture here, he is a flight instructor. His name is Rick Garza. Some may or may not know who this guy is, but he actually is an American citizen, and he is responsible for the flight training of the two suspected terrorists from the 9/11 event. And those two terrorists, they weren't citizens, they were from another country, but they had all of the makings of doing horrible acts to Americans, and pretty much they succeeded. And so Rick Garza, he was the flight instructor of the two suspected terrorists who went on to perpetrate the horrible acts of 9/11, and the plane crashed into the Pentagon. But when they were his students, he asked them to leave the flight club because of their lack of aptitude for flying. So he still teaches students. Every few weeks, he flies the air ambulance out of Blythe. And so it says, imagine for a moment that you're Rick Garza. It's right after the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001, and no one wants to fly. The airline industry has been practically grounded, and so are your hopes of ever working in it as a pilot. So you still send out applications knowing that the competition is stiff among a growing pool of qualified out-of-work pilots. But you also know that at some point, potential employers are going to look into your background and find out you were the flight instructor who trained, and then you flunked out the two who were the 9/11 hijackers. So it's a role Garza has to come to terms with the 13 years since the worst terrorist attacks in the US soil. So and Nawaf al are memorialized in the New York Times, in books, and in Google form the historic narrative leading to the pair's final destination, the Pentagon. So I remember right after 9/11, my biggest fear was my name was going to be in every history book, and that there's going to be something negative associated with it. Garza 56 recall. So it could have went both ways. I could have been a hero or a zero. So instead, Garza credits his connection to the hijack attackers and his conviction to flunk both of them out of the flight training school to the divine intervention. So I remember just being on my hands and knees and thanking God for helping me make the right decision. But people sometimes don't look at it like this. So I'm adding something in here. They look at him as being an American, he's a citizen, and he trained two people from out of the country to fly, and he possibly was he unknowingly responsible for the deaths of many people. And so that's the way some people look at this. And so it's very heart wrenching, and it's very uh, sad. it was a very sad event, and everybody took notice. The whole world seemed to stop in awe and in shock and in fear and in anger. And you notice how everyone rallied together. And so I notice right now the big thing is immigration and how the kids are being treated. But you notice, be careful because these stories are going back and forth, back and forth. First, you want to sympathize and empathize with the people who are being held in these centers. But then nobody has talked about, okay, what about when they told the parents that if you cross, we're going to separate you from your kids? So they felt that they could put their kids out there like that and subject them to the inevitable, not really knowing that they could be murdered, they could be killed, they could be shot or whatever, and just put their kids out there. And now their kids are in these centers being treated, doesn't look so great, but then they say it is okay because they're doing the best that they can. Now, a lot of them they're trying to put in foster care. But as a parent, think as a parent, would you, even if you're in a really bad situation, would you risk putting your kids out there in that? So I don't think people really have thought about this. So whose fault is it really? Should we be looking at what these parents' mindset are? Why why they wouldn't try to do things in a way where they can get processed rather than risking putting their kids in a predicament where they're in jail, they're incarcerated, and now they're separated from their kids. So they're blaming American, I'm playing devil's advocate here. So they're blaming American government when their government didn't care about them and their kids and put them in harm's way. And so we're taking the blame for some other country's failings. And, I don't think people really have evaluated it that way. And then you don't know if some people are going to come over with hostility and try to do some kind of damage now because all of this is in an uproar. And they're going to remember this and you're going to be like, you know what? I'm going to kill Americans because of the anger that is being spewed out there. And so that's what these two guys did, the hijackers. They had all of the makings of not really doing the right things in this country. And we see what the end result was of that. So going on to read, it says neither of the former students was ultimately able to obtain pilot license, but they both ended up as two of the four muscle men aboard American airline flights 77, threatening the crew and the passengers with box cutters and knives, while another terrorist, Hani Hanjour, flew the Boeing into the Pentagon, and all 64 people aboard the aircraft, including the hijackers, were killed. So, as well as 125 victims on the ground. And you know how people reacted to all of this. All Americans reacted to this. They wanted answers, they wanted questions, they wanted to find out, okay, well, how did they learn how to fly? How did they get over here and stuff? And a lot of times, I just want people to kind of also be aware that a lot of times America is giving, and sometimes they give to the right people, and other times at the expense of Americans getting killed, they give to the wrong people. And this is what happens here. And so we're always giving. So life is, as we know it, changed all Americans after that. So some more than others. And so the attacks derailed Garza's shot at becoming an airline pilot and haunted him with nightmares. But the bad dreams have since faded and his flying career is far from over. So I love aviation, he says. As a boy, Garza would climb to the roof of his parents' Bonita home and stare through the binoculars at these little dots dropping out of the sky. So I found out that they were divers or skydivers, he remembered. So he had a love for flight when he was young, this pilot. So he read up on the sport, and in a burst of his childhood enthusiasm, he goaded his friend into riding their bikes 20 miles to get a closer look. So they came home after dark, exhausted, dehydrated, and in trouble with his mom, but Garza was hooked. And so I knew that I was something, and I wanted to get involved with that at an early age, he said. So it wasn't until his 30s that after working several years at the Navy shipyard that Garza decided to pursue his passion in flight. So he said that the ink was practically still wet on his commercial pilot license when he applied for the skydiving place from his boyhood. And so he flew on weekends, days off, and parachutes over San Diego, dropping jumpers out of the modified Cessna 182. And he also learned to skydive. And so he got 24 jumps under his belt. So the company closed about 3 years later, he decided to teach flying full time. So in his early 40s, by then, Garza quickly became a popular instructor, a flight instructor of the Montgomery Field in correct me if I'm wrong, Kearney, Mesa. So I loved aviation and I loved teaching people, and that was a natural, he explained. So in May of 2000, he takes on his most infamous clients. And they have it quoted here, Dumb and Dumber. So the flight instructor, our instruction, he took on these clients, and these are the ones that were involved in the Pentagon killings or the 9/11 killings. So Al-Midhar and Al-Hazmi was set into motion with a phone call from the Middle East. So the Saudi men had the funds, so they had the money to pay and the desire to learn. So Sorby Flying Club told them to come on over. Now, see that? With no questions asked. You know, they're from some place you don't even know where. They've got the money, and then we're giving. We train them. And so I'm going to skip over. So these weren't Garza's first foreign students. You hear that? They weren't his first. And so he was used to teaching would-be pilots from all over Japan, France, Italy, Canada, Germany, and so on. So we're very giving here in America. It's not like we won't give and we won't help people from all walks of life and background, but at what expense? You see what I'm saying? And so sometimes you help the right people, and other times it's a crapshoot. You might be helping the wrong people. The wrong sets of people are certain individuals, may not be all, but it could be a group of people. And so if you have people who their intention is every intention to try to hurt Americans or to try to, bring crime or to try to bring, a cartel group or to try to bring a militia group or to try to bring more social divide among other minority groups or to try to just go out and create domestic terrorism. You don't know which ones of these people are in that group could be possible, risk to American people and American society. So just like he said he taught people from all over, and he was also used to navigating language barriers. So however, it was clear early on that these guys would be a challenge. So the instructor at another local flight school had already turned them down, one of the men after the lesson, because of the poor English. So he wasn't able to communicate very well. But, somehow they did learn how to fly. So to Garza, Al-Midhar looked a bit sinister. See, so he had feelings about these guys even early on before it all had occurred. But what did he do? He went on and he taught them the best he could until he finally had to flunk them out. But with that appeared to be a knife scar across one of them's cheek. So he was quiet and he had a wandering eye and always looking around, Garza said. Al-Hazmi understood English a little better and ended up doing most of the talking. So Nawarf Al-Hazmi actually seemed interested and seemed like a very nice gentleman. So just because somebody seems like they're a nice gentleman, you don't know what their agendas, what their motives are, what groups they come from, and what their ultimate intentions are. And so they could be harboring a lot of hate for Americans, so, we're easy to be infiltrated is what I'm saying. Just this is an example right here. So that's the one I had more interaction with, he said. He seemed like an honest man. At their first lesson, Garza told the men to read the first 3 chapters of their flight textbook, okay, at their next meeting. It was apparent that by the next meeting that they hadn't read anything. So they couldn't repeat back much of less remember the French word for rear components of the airplane. Did you read the chapters 1 through 3? How far did you get? Garza asked. So page 1, Al-Hazmi replied. On their introductory flight, as they neared landing, Al-Midhar began praying aloud in the back seat, not stopping until they touched down. So afterward, Garza approached Al-Hazmi and asked, I'm a spiritual person myself, so who was he praying to? He wouldn't give an answer to who he was praying to. So just kind of shook his head, and Garza remembered this. And so at one point, Garza pulled out the regulation book and asked them to read one of the requirements to becoming a pilot. And to read and to write to understand English that's the requirement. So when asked to explain back to him what they'd read, they gave what had become their standard response. Yes, very good, very good. And so Garza explained they were going to have trouble expressing themselves as they continued training. So without missing a beat, they pointed to the twin engine plane parked nearby and asked if they could learn to fly it. So they had a specific mission on what they were going to do. And they, amongst themselves, talked in their native tongue, and they wouldn't let him on to what their religious beliefs or what their personal agenda was, when all the while they had every intention of killing Americans. And plotting this big thing that we now know in history books as the 9/11 event. And so then they pointed to a larger plane, the King Air, and then a jet. So you have to learn in this first. So Garza stressed, pointing to the small Cessna 172. And so then they asked me if they could fly the Boeings. Okay, so vexed, Garza told them that he had given them one more shot. He instructed them to go home and learn the Alpha Bravo Charlie alphabet used by pilots so that they could make taxi calls to the tower. And so they didn't. They didn't even do that because that's not what their intentions were. Their intentions was to fly these planes and kill a bunch of Americans in the name of their Allah. So the next flight, the men couldn't grasp simple radio communications, nor did they possess the mechanical aptitude for basic flight operations and straight and level flight and left and right turns. So as they took the notes during one of the lectures, Al-Midhar drew the wings on the plane wrong and making them sweep forward rather than back. And so it was like Dumb and Dumber, Garza said. So doing the right thing, Garza was at a crossroads with the 2 students, Saudi students, that is. So they clearly couldn't understand English well or grasp like basic instruction. And so, but it was also early in the training. And so they had the money to spend. They had all this money. And, they had the money we were giving, and we went ahead and allowed them to, take the classes. So many of the flight instructors might have kept them on, Garza said, but teaching is a starving industry. And so someone will pay and you don't turn them down. So Garza knew that he had to do what was right. And so this was when I sat down and said, sorry, guys, I can't continue with you. My recommendation is for you to go to a school and learn English. And so they pleaded him and begged with him that they wanted to stay in the class, and they offered to pay him even more money. And so I felt bad and I had turned them down, but I felt very firm in my decision and I was doing the right thing, and they were going to be dangerous if I continued. See? So he had some eerie feelings about these people in the beginning. So the pair went on to another flight school, which turned them down upon Garza having dropped them. So they probably harbored anger from that also. And so Garza saw them once more, and they returned days later to pay him for the lesson and the one in which they had flunked he flunked them. So I trained two Middle Eastern guys. A year and a half later, Garza was at home with his friend who called and turned on the news and the airplane flying in the Twin Towers. He urged, "Look at this." Okay, and so the first thing he saw was the Twin Towers, the smoke blowing out, and the second plane hitting the second tower, Garza remembers, and the Pentagon crash wasn't far behind. Whole bunch of emotions ran through me, and I didn't make any connection, and they had no connection then. And then he drove to the airfield, and by the name Al Qaeda began floating around on the news. And then the owner of the flying club, Fred Sorby, had heard that the hijackers were Saudi people. And so I told Rick, go get the file of these two guys. Sorby, now 65, remembers. Garza responded with doubt. You don't think it could have been, there's no way it could have been those two guys that he had flunked out, that gave him all this money to learn how to fly these planes. So it was still dark, and the next morning Garza was awakened by a loud banging, and Garza said that the FBI was at his door. You're not under arrest. We just want to talk to you. So come out. And so he came, a shout us outside. He heard a shout outside. And then eventually, the two special agents who sat him down started with a very general question. We understand you're a pilot, and wow, that's great. How did you get into flying? So Garza finally interjected, and look, I have something. I'd like you to tell these guys. So I trained two Middle Eastern guys, and I suspect they might have some connection with the 9/11 attacks. And so when they came to me, they wanted to fly Boeings. So the agent showed Garza the photo lineup of these men. Immediately, he picked out the former students, although they were identified by different names then. So the agents then pulled out of the notebook, and it contained Al Midhar's drawing of the backward wings. And then Garza also learned that a Lemon Grove home of a prominent Muslim leader where his students had stayed was just blocks away from his own home. So the media soon learned the connection between the hijackers and the Montgomery field. And by the time Garza drove over, the plane was swarming, or the place was swarming, that is, with reporters all over the place and around the world. So he quietly removed his business cards, his name placard, and his desk in an effort to keep a low profile, and sought advice from the criminal defense lawyer who was one of his students, but he couldn't stay out of the spotlight. Of course, after the 9/11 attacks, it was crazy. So he agreed to a few interviews, and the New York Times was important. And he felt in his story of his time with the terrorists, it went global. So you did what? So just before the 9/11, Garza went to a job fair for SkyWest. So he probably had problems finding other employment after all of this, because now he's looked at as it's your fault that all of this happened because you had a hand in training them how to fly these planes. And so the small commuter airline many of his friends had gone to. So he had already made a career leap. And so the skies went quiet. And, because people were afraid. So the effects of the attack had on the air travel were devastating even years after. And he still went on to his formal interview with SkyWest soon after the attacks. But then he was all of a sudden competing with furloughed pilots from the major airlines of fewer slots. And so he wasn't hired. So when you get a pool of applicants, they're trying to pick out the very best ones. So top-notch pilots with clean backgrounds, they're going to call those guys first. And I knew that he knew that all of this stuff that happened was going to affect him. And so he applied for several jobs after that, but would stay away from the commuter airlines that included questions about ever being under investigation and affiliation with known terrorists. And so see how that affects people with just one bad decision, thinking you're helping somebody, and now you're bringing in people who could possibly harm people who are innocent. And so Garza found his niche around 2004, flying air ambulances. And so he currently pilots the Cessna 421 for Desert Air Ambulance. And so commuting to its base in Blythe and answering radio calls to ship patients to and from the hospitals around Southern California, Arizona, and Nevada. And so he only works 10 days out of a month, giving him time to pursue other passions of serving on the leadership team of the Rock Church campus in El Cajon. And so he also still teaches flying on the side, and he even had some Middle Eastern students as well, probably ones who don't have those checkered board backgrounds. So he's still giving, but now he's a little more careful. But the only ones whose background he knows, of course. So Rick is an awesome, good flight instructor, very dedicated. Sorby said so he's a very, very good man. Like most Americans nowadays, Garza's do dutiful, follows new travel rules put in place following that 9/11 attack and other terrorist plots, padding through airport security in socks, removing liquids from carry-ons, but he also is realistic about myriad new tactics being dreamed up by those who want to hurt our nation. And so I think that terrorists, if they are really determined, will find a way to achieve what they want to do. So still, it gives him some solace knowing that Al Qaeda had two fewer pilots on 9/11, and then therefore maybe fewer planes, of course. So every once in a while, people Google my name, usually people I work with, and when I tell them, they all are alarmed and a little and say, "You did what?" So that I'm just trying to give people like a little clue as to why some people feel a little perturbed um, by allowing people that they're not really sure if they're really coming for the right reasons. And this is a good example right here. And this guy, it almost tarnished his career to the point to where he was not able to do, but he was able to bounce back because that was a passion of his. And so sometimes people don't realize giving is good, but within what ramifications are you careful, or do you background screen who you're giving and who you're helping, and what are their motives? If they're coming from someplace, they're coming to you with problems, or they're coming to you with a lot of money. What are the what's the background, and what are the motives? What are the agendas of the people, and why are they in the position that they feel that they have to come here for their basic needs, whether it to be learn how to fly or whatever? Okay, what happened in that country that they are coming here? So you have to sometimes question all of that, you know, as a way of protection, because America tends to be extremely giving, and sometimes at what expense. This 9/11, the 9/11 hijackers is a good example. Um, I know some people think, oh, those the people, are you saying the kids are hijacked? No, you know, you never know what are in the minds of the parents, what are in the minds of other people, what are in the minds of we have even teenagers that can commit, you know, acts of violence, you know, even people here that are in America that have committed acts of violence. So if it can happen here, it can happen anywhere, and it can come from anywhere. And so I just wanted to put that out there as a FYI. But anyway, with that being said, I'm going to cut this video off and I will get back with you all in the next video. Like, comment, subscribe. And this is a good example. So sometimes we're very giving, but sometimes to the wrong individuals without really vetting or screening who we're giving things to and what are their intentions, their full intentions. And so innocent people end up getting killed. We don't know because we never really ask, well, what were your true intentions? And so this is a good example. Like, comment, subscribe.